right, is that better? No? All right, we'll give it another shot in a second. All right. Okay, good evening. My name is Sarah Alger. I'm the director of the Russell Museum. Thanks to everyone for being here. So per usual, just a few short notes about museum programming before we start. So, folks who are regulars to our lecture series know that we take July and August off in terms of lectures. However, one exhibit note, July 17th, we're going to have a new exhibit up here in the Putnam Gallery about the School of Medical Illustration that existed here at Mass General from 1941 to 1965. So we're excited about that. And then this fall, we're working on our lecture programming. September, actually this one's going to be on Wednesday, September 12th. We will be screening a 20-minute clip from a documentary that you might have seen on Netflix called Unrest, which is about myalgic encephalomyelitis, perhaps better known as chronic fatigue syndrome, followed by a panel discussion. We are going to be involved in Hub Week again this year. Stay tuned for our offerings for that. And then Tuesday, December 11th, we will have Mass General child psychiatrist Stuart Ablon for a lecture and a book signing. If you're not yet on our mailing list, feel free to sign up. I'll be passing around a clipboard. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers for this evening. First up will be an associate radiologist from Mass General, Rajiv Gupta, who is also director of the Advanced X-ray Imaging Sciences Center here. We'll have Dr. Paul Chapman, who is staff neurosurgeon at Mass General. Rita Freed is chair of Art of the Ancient World at the Museum of Fine Arts. Susan Greendyke is curator of the Commonwealth's Art and Artifact Collections at the Massachusetts State House. And Holly Salmon is senior objects conservator at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. With that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Gupta.
Good evening. My name is Rajiv Gupta, and we have a fun evening today because we are going to combine X-ray imaging technologies with art. Art is the focus, and I have the boring job of telling you something about the science and engineering that goes into building machines. So I'll set up the stage for the rest of the presenters that will come after me. So this is where our story starts. This man is Röntgen. He discovered X-rays in 1895, a few years after ether was discovered, but predates cars, predates airplanes, fairly old technology, about 120 years old. And that's the title of his first paper, A New Kind of Ray. And he said, for brevity, let's call it X. So that's where the term X-rays came from. So that's the lab that he worked in, shown over here. And that's what his lab looked like. Okay, so not a very fancy looking lab. There are like burn marks on the wall, there are explosions going on. Okay, will not pass OSHA inspection today. And this equipment was very common at that time. This is basically a cathode ray tube, the same thing how the old TV technology worked. Basically an electron beam scanning along a phosphor. And he realized that some of his X-ray films in the drawer next door to this apparatus were getting exposed. And it's almost a certainty that other people saw effects of X-ray. And as evidence, this is an X-ray image generated 8 years before Röntgen published his finding. So this is an X-ray image made in Philadelphia by a person whose name has been forgotten by history because his response to this finding was very different. He would write a nasty letter to the company that made X-ray film at that time and said, your quality control sucks. Every so often I get this film that is pre-exposed, and they'll write an apologetic letter saying, sorry sir, we'll replace your film, what can we do for you? And, but Röntgen didn't do that. He went back to his lab. He, as the story goes, for 7 days he didn't leave his lab. Or like 7 weeks or some period like that. And he was like in the lab working very hard, and he figured out that there is some kind of a ray that is coming from this bark and is going through the wood and is exposing the film. And basically the apparatus he had was very, very simple. So this is what an X-ray tube looks like. It's a very old X-ray tube. The dentist X-ray still works by the same principle. So you have a filament in here that is generating electrons. When you run current through a filament, it heats up, it boils off electrons. The electrons are attracted to this positively charged anode, so they'll go like this. And a part of the energy of the electrons is converted into this high energy photons that come out from the tube, and those are what X-rays are. So I give this talk multiple times. I've shown it to undergraduate students, I've shown it to medical students. And I wanted to make the point that X-ray tubes are really simple. It's like you can buy everything needed to build an X-ray tube in Home Depot and Best Buy. Because that's all there is to an X-ray tube. In fact, a few years ago I asked a student of mine to build me an X-ray tube. And he did exactly that. He bought a vacuum enclosure, evacuated it, put this stuff in there, and we have X-rays in my lab, which are, his little tube is still working. So I wanted to make this point. One of the students raised his hand and said, oh, that looks like a crack pipe. And I've not seen a crack pipe. I said, how does a crack pipe look like? Can you send me a picture? So he did. So very similar arrangement. You plug this thing in here, just like you connect over here. There you boil off electrons, here you boil off crack. And just like that anode has an anode angle, is cut at an angle, like this thing also is cut at an angle. And there you generate high energy photons, and here the person gets high. So very similar arrangement as before. So this is the first, these are some of the first images from Röntgen's original paper. There were some weights in a drawer next to his apparatus, and they were exposed. That's his wife's hand. And as someone who looks at these images day in and day out, and who's been trained to read these images, and I look at this image and I go to myself, my God, the great man didn't give his wife a diamond ring. Because diamond is carbon. Okay, carbon is like soft tissues here. We are made of carbon. Okay, so X-rays go through carbon very freely. Even though it's the hardest substance, it really doesn't show up. All you see is the Tiffany mount of diamond. You don't see the diamond itself in a ring. So this is some more cheapo metallic ring. Okay. So back then we didn't know the X-rays are bad for you. So we'll make X-rays of everything. There were companies that sell you X-rayed water that was supposed to be like strong water. You drink water which says the X-rays have been passed through. Shoe shops would have an X-ray machine. So this is one from a shoe shop. And you can tell this is an old shoe because the heel is not glued to the back. It is actually nailed into the back. We don't do that anymore because the glue technology is kind of so good. So this type of technology is good for everything that is two-dimensional. It gives you a projection of whatever is in front of it. X-rays will go through it, the shoe, the heel, the calcaneus and everything, and you get a projection image. So it's a two-dimensional representation of the three-dimensional world. So it works great for things other than human body. So if you had a painting, you could take an image of that, and painting is already a 2D thing, so there is no decomposition involved here. So this is a famous picture by Picasso, and you can do fluorescence imaging on it, and you can actually figure out how much iron there is in different pigments, how much chromium, and so on and so forth. And essentially you're exciting K-shell energies of different elements and measuring what elements are present in the paints that were used. You can also do a full image of this, and this was actually done. This is so this is a picture this is the X-ray image of the same painting. And what you realize is that Picasso took an older painting by some unknown artist and painted over it. Okay, so this is actually a scene of some sort which was painted over. This type of thing has been done for like many paintings right now. Louvre, many people may not know, Louvre Museum in Paris has a huge radiology department. They do like very fancy imaging. In fact, to some extent, they do better imaging than we can because dose is not a limitation. They can irradiate the paintings as much as they want, but it's non-destructive. We can't do that to the patients. So, so I was asked to scan a painting from the State House, and State House was already in communication with John Hartman, and they showed me a picture like this and said this is something that they have produced, but they want to do the same kind of a process with this particular painting. So I won't steal your thunder, and I'll let you tell the story, but this is something that we imaged and what we did with it, one of the talks will cover. Okay. But so far we are in the 2D world. How am I doing on time? Because I completely, there's no timer here, and I don't want to keep talking. 2 minutes, okay. Excellent.
I'll give you 5.
Okay, thank you. So how do we go from this 2-dimensional representation of the world to 3-dimensional representation of the world? And this is a long story, spans about 100 years, and this is the progression of thought. So this is Röntgen. He gave us a physical means of making a 2D projection of the world. You put any object in front of the X-ray machine, the picture that it records is a 2D representation of that. This is Radon, an Austrian mathematician, who came up with the concept of how do we take 2D projections of anything in the world, multiple number of them, thousands of them, and he proved that they are mathematically equivalent to the object itself. So multiple 2D projections of an object can be reconstructed back into the object. This is Dr. Alan Cormack, another Boston person. There is some controversy between Philadelphia and Boston as to who made the first X-ray images. We know the answer to that one. But Dr. Cormack, he was at Tufts. He got the Nobel Prize along with Hounsfield for inventing CT. And he basically gave the mathematical foundation that goes into building a CT. Hounsfield, who worked for EMI, a gramophone company, a record company, they had a lot of money from sale of Beatles, and they had signed up Beatles in like 1960s. And England had this program where if you invest some of that money back into R&D, you get big tax deductions. So they gave a bunch of that money to Hounsfield and said, what can you do with it? He said, we are a gramophone company, he'll make slices of anatomy, slices of brain, put them on the gramophone table, shoot X-rays through them, rotate them, and then make tomographic images of that. That's how the first CT scanner came about. So fundamentally what a CT scanner is, you have an X-ray tube, you have an arc of detectors, and this whole thing spins very fast. Okay, 5 times a second, 6 times a second. That's pretty much the limit of how fast we can spin a multiple gantry. It'll outrun your car if you were to let loose this thing on a freeway. It has to be finely balanced, otherwise it starts doing what the washing machine does. It starts dancing on the floor. So most people think the radiology departments are in the basement because we want to shield the X-rays. No, 0.5 millimeter of lead would shield the X-rays. These machines are so heavy and they will start dancing. The buildings are not structurally sound to keep them on higher floors. Okay, so those are some. So this is what we actually do. We let's see. There's a movie here, and I don't know how to play it because. So this is internally what a CT scanner looks like. It's a movie from General Electric. You have a an X-ray tube on one side and arco detectors on the other side, and the whole thing spins really fast. And you have, so we show you the internal arrangement that's there within. And this is the arco detectors. The tube is on the upper side. With a whole lot of gantry control system. You can actually collimate the beam, take bigger patients, smaller patients. You can adjust it to the size of the patient. And you have, we're generating a lot of data. We are acquiring thousands of images as we are rotating every quarter of a second, every fifth of a second. So there's a lot of data. And that data needs to be transmitted to the stationary computer. So they have a slip ring at the back of the gantry, which is what is used for transmitting the data to the stationary computer. So the system doesn't care whether you have a human being or what you have put in the scanner. So this is a CT scan of a patient. I forget what the patient came for, but maybe this is a TBI case. So there is some confusion over here, but the scanner is completely not mindful of what you're putting in there. So we were asked to image a mummy. And so these are the slices of the mummy that Rita and Dr. Chapman will be talking about. This is the routinar. Unlike the patient, here the brain wart is completely empty, as you can see. And there are lots of findings, radiologic findings, and we've published several papers about it. It's still an ongoing saga, so I will not steal their thunder, and I will move on to and you can focus. We have a full 3D rendition of the world. You can focus on any part of the anatomy. So, for example, here we're showing you the bones, and the bones have something a special story to tell that Dr. Chapman will talk about. And we can also scan other artifacts. So this is a chitara that we scanned from Isabella Gardner Museum, and we'll have a talk about it. So this is what we're going to be doing. We'll be talking about the mummy scan and the radiologic findings, then the anti-clot painting. So I think with that I'll stop, and I'll have Dr. You come in. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gupta. I have to say I learned a lot, and now I know what really happened to Judy Knott. So I have to say I'm really honored to be asked to speak here. This is certainly an august institution, and I'm particularly grateful to have had the opportunity to work with some of the staff members here. And in fact, we've enjoyed a relationship with Mass General Hospital that goes back well over 30 years. And I have to say that is in large measure thanks to Dr. Paul Chapman, who not only has lent his expertise, but also brought together a team of his colleagues. And we at the Museum of Fine Arts have benefited tremendously from that. Now, to be honest, mummies and medicine have enjoyed a long relationship. And I now know that 1895 is when X-rays were invented, because and possibly shortly after the first mummies were X-rayed. Even before that, just by looking at bones, doctors have been able to tell us about certain diseases just visually, like arthritis, cancers, broken bones. And we know that there were a number of ancient treatments that the Egyptians figured out. For example, trepanation, that is cutting a hole in the skull to relieve pressure. Prostheses, we have a prosthetic toe from ancient Egypt. Dental work, a bridge I know about. And this work has also taught us about causes of death. But even more interesting is conditions of life, that what these ancient people went through, how difficult their work was, what kind of work they did even. And today, there's an entire team at the University of Manchester that has the world's largest collection of mummy samples. And I think it's jointly with the museum there and the medical school. And the reason for that is that they're looking for the ancient origins of diseases. Diseases like AIDS, for example, when did that start? And some of these mummy samples may tell us that. Of course, medical x-rays have helped tremendously. I think we have x-rays from the 1930s of our mummy collection, and of which number about 24 as far as I can tell, mummies and mummy parts. And of course, as we've learned since the 1970s, I guess, we've had, with the advent of CT scans, I think the first time they were actually used on mummies may well have been here in Boston with Beth Israel Hospital in the 1980s, and that was in conjunction with an exhibition entitled Mummies and Magic. But I now know, thanks to Dr. Chapman and Dr. Gupta, that the CT scanning that we would have done in the 1980s is like Paleolithic in comparison to the CT scanning we would do today. So, this is another view of the X-ray before. This is the outside of patient Jehudi Nacht. And despite, he had a sort of unique situation because, as you can see, the number of bones we have associated with Jehudi Nacht is very limited. And we really couldn't say a lot about, what conditions he lived under, whatever. But we wanted to know as much as we possibly could know. And I have to say, we turned to our MGH team, and Jehudi Nacht became ever more interesting and illuminating. So, I'm going to take you back at this point about 15 years, or nearly 15 years, to about 2005. And at that point, we decided to mount an exhibition based on the findings of a single tomb in Egypt. That tomb was numbered by the archaeologist 10A, and the location was Bersha, Deir al-Bersha, right here, right where this donkey is. Which, in any event, this is Cairo, this is Luxor, so it's about almost midway between. And one very wealthy governor of a province in that area, about 4,000 years ago, that is about 2000 BC, located his tomb right about there. And if you look carefully, you can see that obviously there's a big cliff, but there's a ledge on that cliff, which he and his colleagues may well have smoothed out. And he located his tomb there. So basically, he was king of the mountain. He could look down on not only the cliff, but the desert, the Nile Valley, the river, and the same thing from the other side. I've been there, I've excavated there. It is truly God's country. It is beautiful. He knew what he was doing 4,000 years ago. So, fast forward to 1915, when the Harvard University Museum of Fine Arts expedition goes to Bersha to excavate. Now, excavation is kind of a loose term here, because what they're actually doing is inserting sticks of dynamite in the cliff here. And in 1915, that was the way they needed to move large boulders. We don't do it that way anymore, but nevertheless, they did certainly succeed, and they, after breaking up those boulders, they uncovered a surface, a rectangular surface, that when they excavated, and they excavated down 30 feet, they came to a burial chamber. So this is a line drawing what they found. You have to think of it an L shape. So an L shape. So 30 feet down here, opening onto a leg here, that is the burial chamber. And moving along, as they got themselves down there, you can just, the ancient excavators were very good. They had little niches that you may, actually are not very clear here, but they're little tiny steps is how they got down there. And this is what they saw. So you're looking into the burial chamber. You haven't gone in yet. What you are looking at is the interior of nested coffins, coffins nested like matryoshka dolls. And you're looking inside the coffin, and of course you expect to see a mummy. But what you see instead are piles of sort of discarded linen. What had happened here is that the robbers had preceded the expedition, tore the head end off the coffin, and yanked out the mummy because that's where all the most precious jewels had been. If you think about Tutankhamun, his most valuable jewelry was in fact on the body. So what you don't see in this picture, what they probably had already removed, was the head that was found right on top of this coffin. Now, that was not the only anatomical part that was found in the tomb. So the head was on top of the coffin, but in the opposite corner was this headless, limbless torso. Turns out, and we know this from the number of coffins, there are a total of 5 coffins nested, 3 in one nest and 2 in another nest. There were 2 occupants of this tomb, probably husband and wife, and both are incidentally named Jehudinot. We know that from their coffins. So it was a double burial. Now, I'm very pleased that they brought this head back, and equally pleased that they left this in Egypt. And ironically, I'm not sure where, because colleagues of ours went back down into the tomb shaft in the early 2000s and did not find this, so they probably just tossed it. In any event, what was equally exciting for us as a museum is what the robbers were not interested in, and that is this crazy clutter of parts of model boats, parts of figures, this all wood, all things that they just threw aside just to get as quickly as possible to what was inside the tomb. So we're looking at models of boats, bakeries, breweries, carpenter shops, brickmakers, people plowing, people force-feeding cattle, and so forth. And as you look at this, I know we have the Gardner conservator here, and I can just imagine what she's thinking, what Holly is thinking, because this is really a conservator's nightmare. And this explains why it was 95 years before we even began to tackle this. But this was the reason for the exhibition we did, so we could get the conservation done. And it was several people who worked diligently on this, but most of all, a conservator by the name of Gwen Ryan, who spent 4 years of her life matching arms and torsos and boats and daily life models and so forth. She, as far as I understand, well, I have to tell you, after 4 years with antiquity, she's now at the Hirshhorn conserving contemporary art. So scared her away. But what she's doing here, she did a phenomenal job, as did a conservator from Egypt, who spent several summers with us. But what she's doing here is using micro balloons as fillers to fill gaps. I don't know if that's medical technology or not, but it was very interesting. And also for areas that were missing paint, she used Japanese rice paper that she glued on with a reversible adhesive, which is also very important for us, and painted it so that as you look at the material today, and you can do that, because it's all preserved for us in permanent gout. After the temporary exhibition, we were able to mount the entire contents of this tomb, which was 11 by 11 by 6 feet tall, and included, we now know, 57 model boats, more than 50 models of daily life. And so we had this incredible reconstruction of somebody's life. Not necessarily somebody's diary and journal, but somebody's ideal of what life should be. So what the reality was and what the ideal was, what the difference was there, we don't know, but we do know that everything that was in this tomb of these two people named Jehudi Nat was their ideal of how they wanted to be remembered for the afterlife. And so, in addition, we had this amazing reconstruction of a life, or a life of a husband and wife, and then we had this head. So, needless to say, we wanted to know everything we could about it. We wanted to get every bit of information we could. Who was this? Was this Mr. Jehudi Nat or Mrs. Jehudi Nat? Was there any pathology here that could help us determine the cause of death? Or was there any other kind of medical condition? What was the, would the teeth tell us anything about the diet or anything like that? So, we knew where we needed to start, and we started right here. We called on our medical friends, and Dr. Chapman came to our rescue. Jehudi Nat was taken to your most advanced CT scanning area, and CT scan, and Dr. Chapman will talk about that in a moment. And we also did a little bit of dental work. We extracted a tooth in the hopes of getting DNA from it. And I'm going to stop right here because there is a lot more to the story that I'm not going to tell you. So, Dr. Chapman.
Thank you very much, Rita. This has truly been a pleasure to be involved in this project, and Raj and I have had a wonderful time over the many years now. It's been almost 20 years that we've worked on this off and on. And when we submitted the head to Raj's very high resolution, at that time, experimental CT scanner, flat panel CT scanner, which was really state of the art. We were able to find some extraordinary things out about this head. With the three-dimensional CT scanning, as you can see, once you've stripped away the wrappings, the rather crude wrappings of the mummy, you're really left with a wonderful three-dimensional portrait of this individual. And it's a very lifelike appearance, which belies the fact that beneath this there's been tremendous mutilation of the facial skeleton, which they, at the time of preparing the mummy, they reconstructed with filling and so forth to pad out the voids that were left underneath the skin. But the other thing I'd like you to note is that the face is entirely intact. It's entirely intact, and keep that in mind as we look at what subsequently became known to us. Now, one of the first things we looked for was whether or not the brain had been removed. Brain removal at that time was uncommon, and it was fairly restricted to people of great importance. And of course, Jehudi Nat was a very important individual during a period when the governors of Egypt up and down the Nile Valley were relatively independent in their ruling of their known or their area of concern. And what we found was that the base of the skull here in front had been broken into through the nose, which was a standard way subsequently of removing the brain, going up one of the nostrils and then breaking into the skull through the very thin area and with hooks and liquid and so forth, they were able to actually liquefy the rotting brain and remove it. And this, arguably, is one of the first examples of this procedure having been done in a provenance context. And that's very important, I think. The other thing that was done back here in the back is they made a hole at the base of the skull and back. And there's only one other example of this having been done, and it was done a little bit later on a princess who had been buried contemporaneously in one of the following Pharaoh's pyramids. And so this was a very unusual business. The reason for doing it, belts and suspenders, I think, was probably that they weren't sure that they could get it all out from one area. So this was an important finding historically and in terms of the physical anthropology of the ancient Egyptian mummy. Now, as Raj showed you, the frontal aspect of the skull looks very jumbled and very mutilated, and in fact it is. And one can't make much sense out of it just by looking at it externally here. And we were able to dissect out the pieces, look at them from various directions, and in slices through the skull, and ultimately made sense of all of this jumble. What we found was that there were several things that the ancient embalmers had done in the course of preparing the body for mummification. Removing, as I mentioned, removing the brain, unusual at that time. But then they also removed the front wall of the maxillary sinuses. And they did that on both sides, symmetrically. That was one step. The next step was to remove the cheekbones, or the zygomas, on both sides. Those are missing. And you'll see this a little bit better with subsequent pictures. And this is a picture of the zygoma from the side in a normal skull. And here it is missing. It's completely missing. And the place where it was extracted and broken, actually it wasn't broken off, it was cut off with a chisel sharply in 3 places so that they could remove it. The next thing that they did, and it was in this order that they did it, very systematically, and they really knew what they were doing. They cut off the what's called the coronary process of the mandible, a very important structure involved in closing the jaw. And this coronary process, for example, is extraordinarily well developed in animals like a saber-toothed tiger, which had incredibly powerful closure of the jaw, as you can imagine. And here you can see it so they just cut this off. And it was done sharply. And you can see it here from the front, and it's symmetrical on both sides. So this was a very systematic, symmetrical procedure that these embalmers performed. It is quite remarkable. And Raj and I puzzled about this. This was totally unexpected. And this is the only example of this in ancient Egyptian history that has been documented up to this point. It's going to be found. It's going to be found in other contexts and mummies, but it's probably going to take a while because this was something that was not done, obviously, very often, and it was done at a very early stage in the history of Egypt, the dynastic history of Egypt, relatively speaking. As Rita said, this was 4,000 years ago. And Raj really had the inspiration. He said, you know, he said, all of these bones are related to the jaw, to the muscles of closure of the jaw. Every single one of them, with the exception of the maxillary sinus walls. And that just allowed the embalmer to gain access to these other bones. That was the point of that. But for example here, this is a master muscle, a very stout muscle, and it's of course widely attached to the jaw, which you can't take out, but it's also, they appreciated, attached to the zygoma, which they did take out. So they went right for the money. They removed the zygoma, which effectively detached the lower jaw, at least from the masseter muscle. And they knew that that wasn't the only jaw, the only muscle for the jaw. And you all know, if you clench your teeth, that this huge temporalis muscle occupies almost the entire side of the head, but it comes down to this point of least resistance, as it were, in terms of trying to deactivate it. And that is, it attaches, as you can see, on the coronary process. And they knew this, and they went for this. And it's really remarkable that they had the skill to do this. This must have been a procedure, as I say, this was clearly done in other contexts prior to this, because this was not something they made up as they went along. Now, I've had a long interest in the Edwin Smith surgical papyrus, which is arguably one of the two most important medical papyri from ancient Egypt. It's a beautiful thing. And in reading through the various cases that are described, surgical cases, there are a lot of head injury cases, which, being a neurosurgeon, I have a particular interest in and have spent a great deal of time going over. I was reading through one of them after we had decided that they were releasing the jaw, and I found that there were allusions to exactly what these people had done. Now, James Breasted was the first authoritative translator of the Edwin Smith Papyrus, and he wrote, as you can read here, it's been customary to attribute Egyptians' knowledge of human anatomy to familiarity with the embalmer, but there's no evidence of that. And contrarily, they got all of their knowledge from dissections. Now, Egyptians didn't do things without a practical purpose to them in general, and they wouldn't do dissections. There's no evidence that they really did, just to find out, just to document what the anatomy is. In fact, most of their anatomical knowledge comes from the animals that they slaughtered. And he concluded that the embalmers had never had anything to do with this. Well, there's one of the cases in the papyrus where the scribe gratuitously includes an explanation of the workings of this bony anatomy, and it is, you can see here, these are terms that are used only in this context in the Edwin Smith Papyrus, of this area here, where they had a great deal of familiarity, obviously, and this area here. And so this was just stuck into one of the, it wasn't really relevant to the injury that was being discussed. It was just put in there to document this for the reader. And another term that they used, which was only used in the Smith papyrus, was referring to the cord of the jawbone, which, as they described it, allows the jaw to close. So they really knew their anatomy, and they knew their functional anatomy. They knew what these bones were for. They knew what the muscles were for. Now these are muscles that are deep underneath the skin in the face, and this is not something you can just intuit by looking at somebody. That's a very important point. So there are a number of things that Raj's technology with the CT scanning and the 3D imaging has provided us with. We have been able to identify a previously unknown example of the ancient Egyptians' a really sophisticated understanding of the functional anatomy and where they got this knowledge, where they got the terms. The second thing is you can obviously appreciate the skill with which these embalmers did this. We actually dissected two cadaver heads to see if we could reproduce this, and this was all done through the mouth. And it can actually be very easily done, and one can do this on both sides in just a little over an hour. And these people knew how to do that. It's really quite extraordinary. And also, this gives us an insight into the early stages of the mummification process. This was not something that was done much after this, but it was an important stage, and it had implications for their theology of the afterlife, as it were, which changed over time, even though mummification continued for 3,000 years after that. So, with that, I'll turn the podium over to the next speaker.
I'm not sure I can top that, but I can bring it closer to home. I will jump right in. John Endicott was one of our earliest and longest serving colonial governors. He was a prominent figure in Massachusetts life and politics for decades. So it's not unusual to think that his family would have wanted to preserve his likeness. It is recorded that a portrait was taken in the last year of his life, which would make this 1665, and would also make this one of only 40 or 45 known American paintings from the 17th century. The portrait descended through many generations of Endicott heirs until its last owner, Judge Endicott, bequeathed it, the governor's chair, and his sword to the Commonwealth in 1935. He had not been treated well. At one point, the portrait was used as a fire screen. And in the 1770s, a scrubbing with soap and sand was ordered. By 1797, William Bentley, upon visiting the estate, noted in his diary that the portrait is much defaced. The face is the only part not entirely gone. The canvas is chiefly bare. And a few years later, he wrote, "It grows dimmer with age." The painting was, we have documentation that the painting was restored at least twice in its life, in 1843 and 1929. However, we suspect there was quite a lot of other work done. This is a terrible time. Many copies were taken of this portrait, including one at the State House that dates to the late 18th century. The quality of the copies varies almost as much as my slides. The portrait was also engraved ad nauseum. You get my point. All of the images that we have of Endicott clearly date back or rely on this early portrait of the governor in his voluminous black robe. And here is the original, newly installed in Governor Saltonstall's office. Its last appearance was during Endicott Peabody's administration during the 1960s. Peabody was a descendant, of course, until it was placed in storage due to its advanced deteriorated condition. In 2014, we received a generous donation from the Endicott Family Association to help us investigate, stabilize, and maybe even restore a little bit of this painting. And our conservator, John Hartman, who is in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, contacted Dr. Gupta to perform the X-radiography portion of the analysis. And Dr. Gupta was making sure the governor was comfortable, and here they are consulting their screens. Since the painting measures 40 inches tall, it was x-rayed in segments, and here you see all of the films stitched together to produce this composite. The first revelations were actually confirmations of previous damage or treatment that we suspected or we could see had taken place. For example, the hole in his cheek had been filled, and his right hand overpainted with lead-based paints, which is why they glow such a beautiful bright white. They also confirmed that most of his face really did survive, as well as the facial hair and the glove, and that the skull cap, column, and swag drape were also likely part of the original composition. The rest was all a surprise. The x-rays showed us, like a good x-ray might, Dr. Gupta hit the jackpot here. Governor Endicott had a left hand, and upon closer observation, it appeared to be gloved. There were unexpected lines behind his back, throughout the robe, and across the lower quarter of the painting were these pentimenti, cleaning lines, overpaint lines, sloppy varnish, a combination of all of the above. All of this was being thrown out while the painting was still in the lab. But these questions guided John and Dr. Gupta to the small changes in the strength and the depth of the x-rays that were being taken in each of these locations. Immediately, these x-rays prompted us to revise our earlier map for paint sampling, for microscopy and cross-section analysis that we use to discern varnish and pigment composition and layering, and to find those all-important grime layers. The painting was also photographed repeatedly during the project under UV, IR, and raking light, but especially in the areas of interest that were revealed by the x-rays. John, by his own admittance, consulted these films every hour of every day for 7 months. After a while, I began to believe him. After removing at least 6 layers of varnish and 3 layers of thick black paint in his robe alone, John reached the scattered remains of the lowest original layers of paint, and the orange imprimatura, which is the toning layer that the artist put down on the canvas rather than the white preparation layer that we're often used to seeing. The character and consistency of the paint were quite distinct from all of the layers above, so he was able to identify and isolate this original paint, particularly when matching them with spots and shadows and lines on the x-ray. I know that's not very technical, but that's what he did. So I'd like to look at our new famous left hand, because it was actually that which suggested the ways in which we might interpret the rest of the painting. So on the left is a detail of this hand location after the painting was cleaned. And by matching the paint patterns with the light and dark patterns on the films, John was able to identify not only the glove, but the angle of the fingers, and also the decoration, which clearly matched that in the other visible glove. Once we had a glove, we had to have an arm, and then we had to figure out what the arm was doing, etc., etc. This required lots of posing. This is John doing his best Governor Endicott impersonation. Many, many Mylar overlays and chalk drawings, all in an attempt to make sense of these scattered islands of paint. On the right is a rough-in of the drape and the column and this and the left-hand glove. So during all of the work in this glove area, more lines of steel blue and brown paint are coming into focus, and it's creating a very curious V shape just to the left of his glove, and a neat row of paint blobs, and that's what they were, paint blobs. And below this were diagonal lines that we needed to make sense of. This is a chalk outline of these lines that I talked about in a detail of one of these circular blobs. These were the hem and buttons of a doublet, and the diagonal lines below the hem were his legs. So John calls me one Sunday morning to tell me that the angle of the knees could only mean that our sitter was actually sitting, and some of the lines behind his back, which we had always presumed were part of the column base, but they never added up. It was never in line. Some of these lines were part of the chair that he was sitting in. So for the first time in the project, we talk about a chair. For about the 95th time in the project, I dropped the phone. Could it be, oh, I'm so sorry, this should have been, these are some of the lines that he's seeing in the paint. So, well, could it be our chair, the one that descended through the family and was given to us with the painting? Unlike the sword, which unfortunately was much later, the chair has been firmly dated by furniture historians to the 1650s. The scale was right, and it would make perfect sense that where he's sitting, he would be painted in his own chair. Mission accomplished. It is clear that none of this could have been undertaken without any of the scientific investigation that we did. From the microscopy of literature, we were confident that the paint of the robe, which was a completely different consistency and composition, chemical composition, could be safely removed. And also from the microscopy, we could identify the artist's limited color palette. Also, the fact that the overpaint appeared under the lowest significant grime layer would mean that it was repainted fairly early, and would also explain why no one who copied this painting knew what lay beneath. The x-rays then just became the crucial guide to the reconstruction of the painting. All of this is, of course, on top of an isolating layer of varnish. It can all be removed and reinterpreted if we need to. I don't think we need to. But for now, we are so pleased that with all the help that we received on this project that we've been able to bring Governor Endicott back to the wall of the State House. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are some wonderful talks. Really interesting projects. I wanted to talk with you a little bit this evening about several medical technologies, actually, in particular, the use of CT scan, and then also some technologies medical technologies that we use to actually care for works of art at the Gardner Museum. So first, this is the Kitara Batente that Dr. Gupta showed earlier. This is also called a strumming guitar that we know was made by the luthier Mosca Cavelli in the 18th centuries, Italian from the region of Perugia. And Gardner very deliberately displays it in the chest that you see here. Sometime in the past, likely before Gardner even purchased it, the neck was probably completely broken off of the piece, and there's a lot of related damage that we could see throughout the object, that including signs of a split between the soundboard and the back, as well as many areas that were caved in and filled with this putty material. And on this project, we worked with conservator Melissa Carr, who had extensive experience treating musical instruments, and so we brought her in to help us. And she had many questions about this structural damage as it might affect her approach to caring for the piece. And in this image, you see her carving replacements for losses to the mother of pearl that are beautifully displayed on the front. There's mother of pearl, tortoise shell, and then also bone inlay on this piece. But some of her key work was to reshape the body of the guitar to bring it back to the appropriate visual appearance of the piece in its entirety. And she wanted to learn about what might be hidden on the interior because we suspected it was too fragile to take the piece apart. We were very pleased that Darcy Karunan, the musical instruments curator at the MFA, connected us with Dr. Gupta so that we could bring our patient in to the hospital here for CT scans to understand more about what was going on with this object. And the scans did indeed give us quite a bit of information about what was going on structurally on the interior. For instance, that we learned that there was a lot of supportive material added to some parts of the interior, such as this dowel that holds up the center sound hole piece. Also pieces that we might have mistaken for repairs, but since we had Darcy here and then also a luthier or guitar maker named Kevin Kelly with us, they pointed out that these cross pieces are actually part of the original construction of the guitar. So important to have experts across the board who can instruct us in what we're looking at. And then in this other image, we saw that, for instance, a rib was placed around the interior of the back to hold it together, as well as blocks at the neck and the base. So it did have quite a bit of repair work to it to help compensate for the structural damage that had occurred. This also confirmed that we couldn't take the piece apart, it was too risky, and also that it never would have been played. So at this point the guitar was too damaged to be played, and Gardner simply wanted it to be placed in this location for its appearance. But most notable to Melissa was what we don't see in any of these images, and it's important to know that it's good to have information that we do see, but there's a lot missing here. And in fact, what we don't see is there isn't any material around the curvatures here and here, which is where we saw the splitting between the soundboard and the back, and also where it had been pushed inward. And the reason why this is important is because it told Melissa that she could safely pull out and reshape those areas of wood without being concerned that there was blocking or other material attached to the back, that she could cause more damage if she then pulls or puts any pressure on from the front. And here you see her work in progress as she's manipulating the original wood material and then also adding splints and other fill material to kind of even out the curvature of the guitar as a whole. And this is an image of the piece before and then after. She did quite a lot of finish work to the surface. Like I said, filled in losses to the inlay, but I think you can make out a little bit that, this is a bit of the bash, that curvature here at the bottom and then here on the top, that she brings back so that you really understand the subtleties and the shape of this piece overall, which is important to the way that Gardner displayed it. Now, in addition to having interest in understanding more about the piece related to the conservation work, there were also scholarly questions as well. And here you see Darcy at the MFA with their Mosca Cavelli guitar. Interestingly, there are only 2 known examples from this luthier, and they happen to be right across the street from each other at the Gardner and the MFA. And I will tell you as an aside, part of the reason is that Darcy always loved the Gardner guitar, and so when one came on the market, he had to buy it. And the MFA guitar had been restored just prior to purchasing, so Darcy actually has images of the interior, and I'm showing here the interior of the MFA guitar, which in its restoration could be taken apart. And I'll just note, going back to this slide, there's this phenomenal condition and can still be played. And this is a wonderful moment where Darcy just walked up, opened the case, brought it out, and then played it for us. So really beautiful. And I think if you go on their website, you can hear a clip of it being played. Sorry, now back to my story. So the MFA guitar, when we look on the inside, we can see that there are sheets of music that are torn up and line the inside like paper mache to hold the very fine ribbing of the back of the guitar together. It also has a maker's label that is signed by Mosca Covelli and dates the piece to 1725. Because the paper wouldn't show up in the CT scan, we did think that we were seeing perhaps edges or density that said that there might be paper inside, but we couldn't read it. We also can't simply look inside this piece because it has this gorgeous, almost filigree-like decoration in the sound hole. It's actually layers of paper that have been carved out to create what you're seeing here inside the sound hole, but prevents us from looking inside. But there are these tiny little holes on each side of the guitar, likely from the point of manufacture. And I think, sorry, you can see those here. So you may guess it, we actually then took our patient for an endoscopy. And so here we are at Boston. Many of us need to have multiple procedures to diagnose problems. So here we are at the Boston Medical Center with a wonderful team there that we met through mutual friends. And we learned that, in fact, the ribs on the back of our guitar were also lined with music and manuscript pages. And I should say at the time we were having a manuscript exhibition at the Gardner, and so my heart stopped a little bit to think that someone just tore these into strips like you do with paper mache and line the inside. So similar to the paintings that Dr. Gupta showed earlier, reusing materials for a new purpose. We also saw a much more modern printed label, and so this tells us that in fact the piece was again taken apart and restored. It would have to be later in the 19th or early 20th century based on having this kind of a modern printed label. And then we did in fact start to see hints of a maker's label that was somewhat obscured. These are some of the wooden restoration pieces that we saw on the CT scan. So here they are that we can see in the endoscope image, as well as quite a lot of dust. These are dust bunnies that you see obscuring the lettering, but the Boston Medical Center team brought in a biopsy tool, that's what this is here, to pick up these dust bunnies, and then also a small tube to blow air in. And in fact, we saw the word Mosca. Covelli was obscured by that wooden restoration. Fecci, which has made this. And then the numbers 1, 7, and 2. The last number was obscured, but we know at least that our piece also dates to the 1720s, just like the MFA guitar. So just skipping really quickly into looking at medical technologies that are also used for treating works of art. At the Gardner Museum and the Museum of Fine Arts, and also at Harvard, Boston area conservators have been starting to work with lasers that were initially developed for dermatology procedures and dentistry. And in fact, I know that some of these lasers were developed here at Mass General Hospital, so I'll show you an image from their website. And for example, neodymium YAG lasers that are used for tattoo removal are especially good for cleaning stone surfaces. And in the same way that it can target tattoo ink and break it down without causing damage to the skin, these lasers can be used to remove dirt and grime and other materials from stone surfaces. And to show an example, this is an archival image of a Spanish tomb relief in the Gardner Museum. This piece is from the late 15th century. You can also note the historic heating grate. At the end, Gardner had coal-burning furnaces, and so the extent of dirt and grime on the surface of this object is apparent here, where you see the laser in operation. Now, it's particularly important that we were able to use a laser with this piece because it's made out of alabaster. And alabaster is a very soft stone that has the potential to be etched by some traditional wet cleaning methods. And I'm going to, forgive me, I'm going to oversimplify this, and I'm not as good with the science. But essentially, the dirt and grime absorb the laser energy from a neodymium YAG laser very well. And they literally vaporize from the surface. Whereas the stone reflects that energy. It doesn't absorb it very well. So we can selectively clean a work of art like this without altering the physical structure of the stone itself. And this is particularly significant because this figure was actually cleaned previously using erasers. And so the dirty surface that you see here was the result of that cleaning, which made quite a difference, but you can see how significantly more we could clean this piece and really portray it with the translucent quality and see the details that were intended. Another quick example, this is marble, and this is a significantly deteriorated marble sculpture, the Persephone sculpture in the Gardner Museum courtyard. The laser technology, because it selectively cleans the dirt and grime from the surface, we can also use it to clean a piece like this where any other physical cleaning method has the potential to remove granules of marble that are eroded, and you can see that in the raking light shot here. This is the dirt and grime and the way the surface looked to us originally, and here you see after it's been laser cleaned that really fragile surface remains intact. And there she is after cleaning. And finally, conservators, particularly in the Boston area, have more recently just started to use erbium YAG lasers, which, as I understand, have applications both for dermatology and dental surgery, as well as other applications. And we're still learning the potential of this laser. It is really new to the field. It targets any surface that has an OH group, so something like water or alcohol. So we found, starting with study pieces like this painting that you see here, that if you apply water or alcohol to a surface, it can clean in incredibly fine layers. And so you're looking at a close-up of the painting that my colleague Jess Kloros was testing. And the laser just disrupts this varnish, and that's what you're seeing here, just enough so that we can then come in with simply a swab and alcohol and remove it from the surface without causing a lot of what we refer to as mechanical action. If you have to use strong solvents and really, we don't scrub a surface, but you don't want to have, you want to have as little of that kind of action as possible. So this reduces that kind of cleaning on a paint surface. And in fact, we very recently used both types of lasers to clean our spectacular 3rd century AD Roman sarcophagus, known as the Farnese sarcophagus, in preparation for a show that opened just on Thursday, and features this object. And just to show you the transformation in some of the work that we did, we used both types of lasers that I've referred to tonight. So the neodymium YAG, or tattoo removal laser, helped us to remove black crust from industrial pollution, as you see here. And then the erbium YAG, or dentistry laser, helped us to then reduce the yellowing that we saw on the stone underneath that. And just a small plug to please come see the show that opened on Thursday, Life, Death, and Revelry, on view until September 3rd. And thank you very much to Dr. Gupta and his team, as well as Dr. Archana Sifela at the Boston Medical Center, and everybody else that worked with us on both of these projects. Thank you.
We're getting late in the day, and I would like to invite all the speakers to come to the podium, and we're going to open the floor for questions and answers. And while they're assembling up front, I don't know if you guys noticed, all the patients that were presented were called Santa Claus, with the exception of Jehoiakim, where we actually created, because he's a real person, so we created a medical record number for him, and we created, so he has a tax record, he has a full medical record, with the exception that we could not enter his date of birth. The computer system is not set up to take the date of birth in BC. So So with that, I think there was a question in the back.
Thank you for several wonderful talks. I have two questions. First is, in general, with the X-ray technology that's involved in imaging of this, I'm sure for medical purposes there are very strict guidelines for what energies you can use. But when you're doing something with this kind of restoration, can you vary the energy of the X-ray in a way that lets you do different things? And the second question is, in the images of the governor, where there are multiple images put together, it looks like there's huge contrast between one region and another region. And I'm wondering why there's so much contrast there, and whether that caused trouble in doing that work, or whether that was done on purpose in a way that helped you do the work. Thank you very much.
Sure. So I think I'll take that question. So both great questions, somewhat technical. So let me try to explain without getting too technical about it. There are guidelines, and in fact, I mean, we're not taught that during medical school or during our radiology training. But if you read the literature, you can find at what energy to set the tube at in order to get a good picture. But that voltage varies. So in fact, I did not know how should I set it up. And I knew this radiologist in Paris who has worked for Louvre, and I had to consult him as to what should be our kV and MA setting in order to get a good picture, because we use the same energy as we use for human beings, just a centimeter wash. There's hardly any material in the middle. So you have to really tone down the X-ray. And the answer to the second question is essentially the same. There is the painting was scanned in pieces, and we don't have all the settings. The kV setting goes in certain increments, and we picked the best setting for that particular frame, but we could never match it from frame to frame, and that's why you see the edge effect in different frames look slightly different. Any other question?
How were you able to determine the order of the involved procedure?
You want to take it?
Well, actually, we took advantage of the fact that ENT surgeons for many, many decades have drained or gained access to the maxillary sinuses through an incision behind the upper lip at the angle between the lip and the gum. It's a standard procedure that has been done. And so we knew how you could get into that area very easily. And then it's just a matter of logically following how they get from point A, B, C, D. Once they've opened into the maxillary cavity, then they have very wide access to the lower rim of the orbit, and also to these attachments of this cheekbone, the zygoma, more inferior and posterior. It's a very wide space, actually. And then once, in order to take off that coronoid process, you can't do that just by going through the mouth. You would think logically that you could, but you can't. You can't get from here to there through the mouth. And so they had to take off the zygoma before they could take off the coronoid process. So it's just understanding what the surgical steps have been in the past for approaching that area in relatively modern medicine. The interesting thing about this was that in doing these cadaver head dissections, we did them with the oral maxillofacial surgeons, Dr. Caven and one of his assistants. And there is actually there are actually a variety of conditions that require the surgeons to remove the coronary process in order to mobilize the jaw, whether it's congenitally hypertrophic, overdeveloped, or if there's some scarring of the muscle, so that the patient can't open their jaw. And the interesting thing is that once the usual approach to that is making an incision up here much higher on the head, and then mobilizing the zygoma, the zygomatic arch, out of the way so that you can come down and remove the coronary process. And after we finished doing this, Dr. Taven realized that this would be to do it through the mouth, transorally, would be a much better way to do it. You would avoid any exterior incisions. In fact, he subsequently reported that in the oromaxillofacial literature, and he called it the mummy procedure. But it's just logically, it follows one to the other once you know the anatomy. And that's the remarkable thing about how these people developed that practical knowledge. As I mentioned, they not only had names for these bony structures, but in the context of the gloss where they described these, they've explained that that's what allows the jaw to close. It's absolutely fascinating. I'm at a loss to really know how they did that, but they were very clever people.
Go ahead.
Were you able to determine anything about, were you able to determine anything about whether this was male or female, or anything about diseases or individual experiences during their life?
There's a long history, and I think I'll let Rita tell that.
The answer is finally yes. You should tell the story.
Well, funny you should ask. Normally, as I understand it, anthropologists and medical doctors can look at a skull and based on some of the muscles of the face and bones of the jaw can give a pretty good guess about whether a skull is male or female. However, those very muscles and bones were the ones that were removed in the mummification process. So in the end, what we did here produced nothing, except in terms of being able to sex the head. However, I did allude to some dental work that we had done, and Dr. Chapman, I think, located a DNA researcher here, Fabio Nunez, and he had this, at the time we did this, 2005, 6, 7-ish, nobody had ever succeeded in getting DNA from a patient this old. But we, Fabio was very well connected, and we bravely, I just stood and watched. The doctors performed, they crossed over fields from neurology to dental work and extracted a tooth, which then was promptly sent to the Defense Department labs in New York. And nothing happened for a good while, and in the end, they either didn't have time or couldn't get any results. And Dr. Nunez then advertised what I understand is a Harvard bulletin board saying, does anybody have any ideas about this? And a medical doctor who was, or a researcher who was based in Israel contacted him, and Mass General sent the tooth to Israel. The MFA does not send human remains around, so that was left to the hospitals. And And they embedded in resin and tried a process that they had developed, and with no results. And a few more years went by. And then one day I got an email from the FBI. As it turned out, somebody from the Defense Department lab had moved to the FBI, and lo, this is at least 5 years later, had kept this tooth in her mind, because they were expecting a researcher from France who was developing a new technology on reconstituting very degraded DNA, and that was the problem. And we arranged for the tooth, again, the MFA from afar, to have the tooth have these human remains sent back from Israel to the States, to the FBI labs in Quantico. And months went by again, and I didn't hear anything. And then I heard that the researcher who had arrived from France was practicing on other remains, just as you had practiced on modern cadavers. And the net result was one day I got an email, and it's a boy. That is thanks to the FBI. And I'm going to tell you, you may wonder why your tax dollars went. But this was the body fluids department of the FBI, and they very wisely realized that if they could get DNA from what is arguably going to be the most degraded sample possible, then they can get DNA from anything. And I have to tell you that hardly a month went by. This all developed within these last couple of months. Hardly a month went by when I didn't get an email from a colleague at the Brooklyn Museum who said, I have these swatches of mummy hair. Do you think, no mummy heads, just swatches of hair. Do you think the FBI would be able to help us? So I connected the two of them and stepped out of it. I'm not sure if that's going to be a big sideline for them. That's a long explanation.
Maybe two more.
I noticed that the laser cleaning was done on alabaster and marble, those were the two examples you showed. And I was wondering, would it work on darker stone? Would that be a problem? The dirt is obviously dark, and the marble and the alabaster is very light.
Right, that's a great question. That particular laser at that particular wavelength wouldn't, and it has the potential to alter the color of the stone or cause damage. You can use a different wavelength that might allow you to have some applications, but typically not. It does work well for cleaning bronze surfaces and other surfaces that have a reflection to them. It can have that kind of a self-limiting property, but that's a good question. That particular laser doesn't work in that way. The erbium YAG laser, the one that we're using, really only in the last couple of years starting to experiment with, doesn't have that problem. It really is just working in layers. And so, for instance, on the sarcophagus, we use it to reduce yellowing in the image that I showed, but we also did use it to reduce that pollution crust, the industrial pollution crust material, in areas where we thought we might have original pigment and gilding. There's actually, as far as we think, quite a lot of original pigment and gilding on that piece. And so we could safely use the neodymium YAG laser in areas of restoration where we knew we weren't worried about losing that material, but it could, it beautifully removed pollution crust, but it would also then beautifully remove all of our ancient pigment. So we use the erbium YAG laser. It works in painstakingly thin layers, which is challenging for a conservator that's spending hours and hours just sort of working your way down, but it was so controllable that we could in fact work slowly enough to identify. There were a few areas where we found Egyptian blue pigment, it's thought to be the first metallic pigment, as well as some reds and golds underneath, and then stopped so that we didn't risk the imaging. Sorry, there's more than you asked for in the question.
Is the neodymium YAG laser and the erbium YAG laser, do they differ in ways other than the frequency? Are there waveforms or intensity or anything else that makes them qualitatively different besides the wavelength?
Yes, to a certain extent. I mean, they operate in different ways. And sorry, and forgive me, this is not my forte. If there are any dermatologists in the group, help me out a little bit. For those that don't know, the neodymium and erbium refer to the crystal that's used in order to produce the laser energy. And the equipment varies in terms of the amount of energy that's produced. So the neodymium YAG laser that we use, part of it has to do with the wavelength of light and then also the amount of energy. It's a high energy unit. The erbium YAG is much lower energy and lower wavelength, so it's much more controllable. I'm not sure if that answers. Oh, and then, and I don't know if this answers your question, we can also alter the energy output as well as the repetition rate at which the laser is emitted. And those do sometimes have applications in terms of how well they do or don't clean and how far we can go with it. We certainly could cause damage if we went too far, went too high energy.
Thank you.
Thank you again, everyone.